All right, welcome back. Glad you guys are here for Tuesday night. I have a slight problem. Some of my notes for the book we're going through got lost all of a sudden, so that shouldn't happen. Give me 1 second. I'll just talk for a minute, and then while I'm doing this. Well, welcome to Tuesday night Theologetics. We're excited to be here. We'll just kind of, I'll just work my way through it just with a fresh book, and we'll just kind of see what comes up. That's a bummer. Anyways, that's weird. 1 second. Let me just give it one more point. Nope, we don't like that. That's one of those moments that happens. That's why you don't ever trust technology. Just kidding. All right, well, welcome back. I'm going to just try to reset everything. Just excuse me while I'm talking. So here's the deal. We've been covering God's Undertaker by John Lennox, and we're going to be in chapter 5 tonight. And the book is great. I'm only able to take us through some key parts in the book. And the goal is not to belabor his points. I'd spoken in the very beginning of starting this book that, the issue that why we're doing it is that I believe that the new atheists kind of, back from, again, God's Undertaker was written by John Lennox, mathematician, 2007, as a response to Richard Dawkins in 2006, The God Delusion. And again, none of this is really relevant in one sense to kind of the time we're in. In other words, we just came through a very politicized time, and it's gone. Wow, that's great. All right, well, whatever. So we live, in a very politicized time, and like I said, one of the big things that we've been talking about again and again and again in the politics of everything is sort of the value judgments that are being put forward aren't necessarily rational ones. They're value judgments that are based on sort of institutions of power. And so when you think like Marxist thinking, remember we mentioned kind of on the left, is something that comes out that words themselves and arguments, everything is just a guise for power. So if you make a good argument or a bad argument, it's kind of irrelevant. It just matters that who has the power in the argument itself, not the content of the argument. And so all of this is really religious kind of heretical thinking. Everything is about sort of saying the slogans and doing this. And so in this kind of time, the societal sort of pendulum swing isn't going to be towards some revival of Christianity. I think what's happening is you have on the left, the right, and the middle, all people are kind of reverting to sort of power dynamics. And the church is also doing that largely in some of the discussions online. Back when we started this book, I was mentioning Nick Fuentes, who's already out of the news. And I guess what I'm concerned with is that we're coming through a time right now that's mainly, if I could say one thing, it's propagandistic. And propaganda is a really interesting thing. What I mean by that is, what do I mean by propaganda? If you have noticed your friends and the things that they're interested in, some of you in this room we talked about, how long ago was it? Some of you, we talked about Israel. So how many of you, about a month ago, remember everyone talking all the time about Israel and how much they're so like, I feel like, do you think the U.S. supports Israel too much and all this stuff? How many of you guys remember that 1 month ago? I just want to make sure I'm not. Okay, thank you. The reason I ask this is that I think one of the things about our time right now is that we move on so quickly from things, and I have to remind us of it because we need to remind each other that we were all there, okay? And I guess I'm trying to say is that all your friends that were like, hey, what's the deal with Israel, and what about this? I don't think many of them are probably still saying that. Now, correct me if I'm wrong. How many of you, when you think about all the Israel stuff you heard about, are still hearing about it right now with the same vigor? Anyone? What do you mean? Isn't that crazy? In fact, what are maybe your friends on the social media saying right now? Maybe it's something about ICE, or I don't know, have you guys heard more about ICE perhaps, right? Let me see some hands. You guys all hearing about ICE. Wow. What we're not hearing about a lot is climate change. I thought that was like the most existential crisis that we've ever faced. I remember some of all the legislation that was being passed and the EV stuff. We're not really hearing about that. In fact, car companies, I know Porsche and Stellantis that makes the Alfa Romeo. These are all cars I'm excited about. They had to move back and redo their next line of cars because they were totally set on the EV stuff, for environmental reasons, obviously. But then when they realized that the money wasn't there and it wasn't actually working out and the EV thing was kind of fraudulent, what are they all doing? They're going back to the drawing board and getting rid of their EVs so they could come out with, ICE engines. Isn't that kind of funny that we use ICE in that way? Internal combustion engines, not immigration, customs, and enforcement. But that wasn't meant to be such a segue into each other. My point simply in all this is to say this. One of the things we get stuck on that we need to face, and I have this discussion with my kids all the time, is maybe their friends, like that they get into arguments about, they will say something politically, and they just repeat what they're told. And You just have to ask yourself, if you have strong opinions, and those strong opinions happen to be the same strong opinions that the media is telling you to have, using the exact same slogans the media is telling you to have, you're not a free thinker, and you're not deep. You're literally spouting propaganda. You're a propagandist. And we're often ourselves part of that same cycle. And so as the media moves on, we forget, none of us are fighting the climate change issue. You're a climate denier, this and that. I mean, we're getting gas cars, and no one's changed. I mean, Elon Musk is stopping to make some of his Teslas to start making robots. We're like, and oh wait, Elon Musk became the bad guy again. Is he still bad? Is everyone anti-Elon Musk? I don't see people protesting that anymore. They just kind of vaguely don't like him anymore. It's none of it's about an issue. It's about holding on to power. And whatever propagandistic slogan can get everyone galvanized to be mad at another group, to give power to someone else, is going to be the keep thing going on. And the dumbness that we have is often to engage. It just feels like, why engage? And so you just ignore it. And so the problem with that is secularism is an old school picture, a romantic picture in our culture where people believe in objective truth. And so the idea that people want to go back to that is not immodest. It's a basic case. And I've heard some notes from some of you that in your social spheres that you're hearing people start to go back towards that secularism way more rapidly than I thought. I thought it wouldn't be till 2028 till we see the new atheists kind of return, but we're seeing it happen already. And so this book is really helpful. And again, the purpose of this book is to, in one sense, spike the ball, because many of the people, Dawkins himself, who wrote The God Delusion, saying that Christianity is essentially the dumbest thing that exists on planet Earth, just recently, now 20 years later, essentially, tells us that he wants the Western world needs to re-embrace Christianity because it's the best environment, essentially, for science and rationality. And so, the sheer bombast and confidence of the new atheists is what I kind of wanted to address. So tonight, like last week, we talked about the designer universe, and tonight we're going to talk about sort of the designer biosphere in a really general way. And so we're going to go through Lennox. Now, I had notes, and so I don't know if we're going to try this. I don't know. Maybe it's on my phone. Yeah, this is one of those things where you have that thing. Let me see if it opens up on my phone, right? Maybe that'll happen. Wouldn't that be great? If you want to hear a book about spies, though, I got that on here we can read tonight. That's a great book. I've got a spy book. Where's this God's Undertaker one? Don't have it on here at all. So let's have some fun. So chapter 5, God's Undertaker. We're just going, hardcore. All right, so the last section we talked about was physics and cosmology, right? And how it was fine-tuned and rationally intelligible. Let me pray. Lord, we need you. I need you. All my tech is down, but that's okay. Who needs tech? And so just use me and use tonight and help us to see your design and all these things, including moments like this. You are good. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, so last time we talked all about the idea of the fine-tuning. What's up? What did you text to me? Oh, no, I don't need the notes. I just need my book. So when I teach, you guys want to know how I do? So when I do sermons, you guys ever curious what I look at here? No? Yeah, some of you. On my sermons, what I give you for notes, I don't have. That's not in front of me. What I do is I'll usually write out in shorthand, essentially, some of the main parts of my intro conclusions for my sermons. That's new. That's mainly not for you. It's because when I go back through, I'm trying to write my commentaries, I want material to go back to, and so that's how I'm doing Genesis, and so I'm setting myself up because I go back to my sermons like you would on the website because I don't remember what I said till I look at it, and so having something written out special, but then all the middle section is all just like arrows and just a couple one-word things. For Tuesday nights, I literally just have the book, Lennox's book, and I just have highlights in different colors, and those colors mean things to me. And so it helps me know what to skip over, what you guys don't need to see, and if I do a different highlight in a paragraph, it makes me realize I want to stop at a certain point. This is all I do. And then I write a paper at the end. That's kind of what I'm looking at. Tonight, we just have text. So let's go. Let's have some fun. So here we do it. So basically, last week, we talked about the biosphere, just think cosmos, think of the design in the universe. And now we're going to look kind of more inward and sort of towards fine-tuning in the biological world, right? From the non-living to the living world, and ask the question whether biology confirms the same impression of design. Can you see a designer? And at first sight, obviously, it appears to do so overwhelmingly. This isn't really controversial. You look at the world right now, you see design all over it. In his Royal Institution Christmas lectures, broadcast in 1991, Richard Dawkins says, quote, "Living objects look designed. They look overwhelmingly as though they're designed. Now, this is a really important highlight. In fact, I had highlighted it. This is still irritating me so much. One would highlight that. I had highlighted it. But here's why that's so important. I've been in debates, and I'm a little more unfettered. I'm going to tell you all sorts. We're going off script a lot tonight. When people ask me why I don't debate, I used to be more prone to want to do more formal debates. People usually don't change their minds from debate, and that's why I don't want to waste my time with it. The people listening might get help, but usually what you're doing is just talking to your own side, and they're wondering who scored points. But over coffee, you can much more easily deconstruct worldviews where there's like an opportunity. And I've been in some debates, some serious, some more, friendly. And one of the common things I will constantly say is the universe looks designed. We can at least agree upon that. And I've met many people that say, it doesn't look designed. And I'm like, can you find anyone that agrees with you? And they're like, what? Scientists. I'm like, the atheistic scientists all agree that the universe looks designed. It's really important we establish this. It's not, again, does it mean it's designed? No, that's not what I'm saying. Modest statements are terrifying to people because we're not used to that. We like cliches and overstatement. Modest statements, by their definition, allow you to say powerfully, bold things in a modest way. You don't have to couch them with a bunch of caveats. And so when Dawkins says that living objects look designed and they look overwhelmingly as though they're designed, it's a really key admission. In fact, from the time of the great thinkers of the ancient world, Aristotle, Plato, and the rest, all the way to modern biologists, the living world has been a source of never-ending wonder, right? And here's the other thing. The more that we uncover in science, the more the wonder grows. So, for example, when Darwin wrote The Origin of Species, molecular biology did not exist yet. So to Darwin, they're like, well, see the finches and the beaks? Well, they would just change because you just could look at the actual beaks and think, well, this could become this and this could become this. But the cell to them at that time was just a mass of goo. It was just like, what's inside it? I don't know. It's like stuff, goo inside the cell. So there was no complexity. And so as we get into cellular biology, we realize the protein structures and little mechanisms and machines that make everything is more complex than we could ever imagine. More complex than you could ever imagine. In fact, that's one of the reasons I said again and again, the basic timeline even for abiogenesis that they're trying to tell us that we needed to have everything come from nothing through evolutionary mechanisms. What they do is they basically create a black box, and they say, well, look, everything looks designed, but that's all an illusion given to us by time plus chance. Time plus chance, random mutation, equals the illusion of design. That's literally what Dawkins and the gradualists, is what they're called, evolutionary gradualists, call it, is that if you have enough time and enough chance, you get the illusion of design. And some people say, Matt, you're not giving a very fair definition. I'm like, that's literally their definition. Dawkins says basically the same thing almost identically in his book. That's his. So what I'm trying to tell you is that if you have enough time and enough chance, enough random mutation, you get something that's the illusion of design. And you say to yourself, I'm not sure that makes sense because the mechanism that you're using to do these things is not ordered. It's random. So I use the analogy again of the soup. You can use it again. If you want to spell, my favorite cat is a Cheshire cat with soup, the alphabet soup, you take the spoon and you do it again and again, and finally you get my to pop up. But when you put your spoon back down, the same mechanism that gives you my ruins it. It's not like you get my, because what Dawkins in his book says, here's how it works. He calls it the skyhook theory. And when you read God's Undertaker, this is one of the most irritating things. In fact, that chapter is embarrassing. It's philosophically, it's revealing. I hope this man gets saved. It's just a revealing chapter. Because his whole point is the way that you get the mechanism of randomness is, yes, of course you could write Shakespeare with a bunch of random chimps with typewriters eventually. Because what happens is as soon as you get them to accidentally type in the word methinks, you just put that to the side. And then eventually, they get the word doth, and you say, okay, doth, and protest, and you just go through each thing, and you methinks the doth protest too much. You're like, oh, and you just put it off to the side. Like, look, randomness spelled this. I'm like, no. You did. You just used a random mechanism, but you had an idea. You wanted to spell something, and when you got the letters through the mechanism, you took them out. All that proves is design. It proves purpose, and the mechanism might be random. And so that doesn't prove it at all, but what they do to make that not seem so dumb is they say, well, just extend it out even longer. If you say, yeah, Matt, that's fine, but what about if you had a million, trillion, billion, bazillion years of opportunities? Maybe one time the spoon would come up with Shakespeare. And you say, so it's the same thing with the multiverse. All of it's trying to do the same thing. It's a black box where you say if you get enough of it and shake it up, it's just giving us the illusion of design. Pause. But we all agree it looks designed, right? Yeah. Christian, this is your argument. Stop arguing stupid things. Stop arguing things you don't know. Just make more basic arguments. But just be more basic. Be more modest. Don't try to win everything. Like our political system right now. You know how if someone actually hired me. In fact, if someone wants to hire me to be a left-wing pundit, I could help them win elections really easily on the left, because all you have to do is make moderate statements. They could say, even with ICE, I'm pro-immigration enforcement. I'm using this as a great example. Our political system is so stupid because people only make stupid arguments. We're a stupid society now. Why? It's never enough for them just to say, we agree that we should enforce immigration too. We just think that the way it's being done isn't appropriate and that we need to have a better system in place. That's not the argument. They're like, no, we think that this guy that is a criminal is great. We love this guy. Well, that's the terrible argument. Why would you make that argument? Why would you do that? And that we do that all the time. Instead of just saying, we all agree it looks designed, we're like, nah. Oh yeah? Just none of that's effective. And so Dawkins' point here that living objects look designed is a big deal, right? We can talk about the amazingness of different animals and the giraffes and the design and everything. I don't need to get into that. But there's no doubt that nature gives us an overwhelming impression of design at the very least. Richard Dawkins even defines biology to be, quote, the study of complicated things which give the impression of having been designed for a purpose, unquote. But that, he says, but that, say he and many other sciences, is all that it is an impression of design, admittedly a strong impression of design, but it's not real. Francis Crick, who won the Nobel Prize jointly with James Watson for the discovery of the double helix structure of DNA, warns biologists not to mistake that impression for what is, in his estimation, the underlying reality. Quote, biologists must constantly keep in mind that what they see was not designed, it was evolved. Unquote. That is an assertion. I want you to understand the difference. That is not an argument, it is an assertion. It is no different than me telling you have to remind yourself, no matter what you see and hear in the Bible, that Muhammad really is, what are you talking about? It's what the Catholic theologian has to tell you. No matter what it says right here, Jesus did not have brothers and sisters. That's like his cousins. No matter what it says, you're like, oh my God, it's the same. It's cultic thinking. It's not real. We should reject it. Such statements, though, provoke the question, why? Why do we need to remember that this is the case? And let me make a caveat at the front end so that if someone listening, they don't get the wrong impression. Let's be honest. Evolution, we're going to have to define in the next chapter what we mean. There's a bait and switch. And so I wrote a paper about this. Christians, stop fearing the term. Let's just make sure we define it properly. Sometimes you say microevolution. I'm like, no. Observable evolution in a lab is something you can see. You can see natural selection. You can see that there is a order that comes out of different things. That there's a reason that animals look a certain way, and there's a reason that the finch's beaks look a certain way. We can show that demonstrably. You can take things and see those things. What we're saying is we agree with all those things. That's called adaptation. What we don't believe in is speciation. We don't believe in what we call macroevolution, or what I like to refer to as abiogenesis, and we'll explain that in a little bit. But the big question we have to ask ourselves is, why do we have to make the statement that things might look designed, but they're definitely not? I mean, if it, quacks like a duck, waddles like a duck, why not call it a duck? I mean, why are we so scared to make the obvious inference? Why are scientists rather scared to make the obvious inference and say that living things look as if they're designed precisely because they are? Or maybe, what about this? Is it possible they look designed because they are? Right? That's the big thing. And there's a point. I've said this again and again. You've heard me say it, but I want to put it on record. Lots of times when you speak to someone that says they're an atheist, they say, well, I don't need to give you my view. You say, well, you have faith because you're an atheist. They say, I'm not telling you what I believe. I'm telling you that I don't believe in something. Sam Harris and Dawkins used to say, I believe in just one less God than you do, because we're all atheists about all the other gods, is what he's saying. I'm like, okay, right, but you do have a view, and they try to skirt the issue. You guys, anyone heard this before, something like this? I'm an atheist. I don't need to make a positive argument for my belief. But when I say to you on the other end, I say, is it possible that things look designed because they are? And they say, yes. Great. What reason do you have for rejecting that hypothesis? But that's not what they say. That's not what they're saying right now. They're saying it's not possible that it is designed. Well, that's no longer atheism. That's anti-theism. That is a statement that needs to be backed up. It is, again, it's all bait and switches. You've got to call people on these things. Okay, so Again, their point is the answer is the appearance of design is illusory, since in their view, evolutionary processes that involve no intelligent input whatsoever are capable of producing all of the teeming complexity that we see in the universe. And of course, this view is forced upon them by their presuppositions. And so a presupposition, again, is the beliefs we come to. It's our lens, okay? Daniel Dennett, in his book, Darwin's Dangerous Idea, puts it this way. Darwin was offering a skeptical world a scheme for creating design out of chaos without the aid of mind, unquote. Dennett regards Darwin's idea as a kind of corrosive acid which threatens to destroy all pre-Darwinian views of the world, in that instead of the universe's matter being product of mind, God said, and it was so, the minds in the universe are really a product of matter. They are nothing more than the results of an undirected, mindless, purposeless process. So it's proper to frame it these ways. Two things. Is it possible that everything looks designed? Because it is. That's the first statement. The second one I want you to remind yourself to talk to people about is this. What makes more sense from what we can observe? What is a better, explanation for the data? Mind becomes matter, or that matter becomes mind. Inorganic becomes consciousness, mind. Now, if they answer the second one, because they have to in that point, they'll say, well, matter becomes mind. I'm like, do you know, is that what you actually think? Because what Lennox doesn't go far enough into is the guy I keep referring to, but Rosenberg, I think Sam Harris refers to this all the time too, is that matter never can become mind. It's too big of a gap. And so what they say is that matter never becomes mind. It becomes the illusion of mind. And so you have no self, because self is something we hold into our mind. You have words are things that we know in our mind. And so you start to say these things are illusions. What you have is chemical processes. And remember, we talked about immaterial things and ideas and truth. And so mind doesn't exist. And so they say these things to you using words to speak to selves about the fact that you have no words and you have no self and these things aren't real. And you say, it basically, when you push a conclusion to that view, the boldness of that claim is silly to the max, but they make it. They make it nonetheless. If you're ever curious, look up a guy named Rosenberg, who was a famous atheist philosopher in, I think, 2010, all the way back. But when you look at this idea, when he says, we might wonder the capacity of this amazing evolutionary engine with its creative power to produce life and consciousness from mere matter, its ability to craft nature's magnificent patterns and to construct its information processing and mechanisms, all the cells, the rest. Not a divine mind, says Richard Dawkins, but a purely materialistic and unguided mechanism. However tempting it is to think that nature has been designed for a purpose, he claims, there is no need for a divine watchmaker. Quote, the only watchmaker in nature is the blind forces of physics, albeit deployed in a very special way. A true watchmaker has foresight. He designs his cogs and springs and plans their interconnections with a future purpose in his mind's eye. Natural selection, the blind, unconscious, automatic process which Darwin discovered and which we now know is the explanation for the existence and apparently purposeful forms of all life, has no purpose in mind. It has no mind and no mind's eye. It does not plan for the future. It has no vision, no foresight, no sight at all. If it can be said to play the role of a watchmaker in nature, it is that of the blind watchmaker, unquote. Dawkins claims that nothing but laws of physics are needed, which is a point we want to remember because we're going to return to that, is a big point because nothing in evolution says anything about physics at all. But the illustration he's dealing with was a guy named Paley and his watchmaker and the metaphor about it. And there's a reason for this. This guy's been, dragged through the mud forever. But his basic statement is a powerful statement, and this one we've talked about a lot. What does he talk about? Well, where am I at? He says, here's William Paley's statement. He says, in crossing a heath, suppose I pitched my foot against a stone and were asked how the stone came to be there. I might possibly answer that for anything I knew, to the contrary, it had lain there forever. Nor would it perhaps be very easy to show the absurdity of this answer. In other words, you couldn't say I wasn't right. How'd that stone get there like that? You're like, I don't know. Who knows? Right? That's his point. Nor would it perhaps be very easy to show the absurdity. Okay, but suppose I had found a watch upon the ground, and it should be inquired how the watch happened to be in that place. I should hardly think of the answer which I'd been before given, that for anything I knew the watch had always been there. The watch must have had a maker. There must have existed an artificer who formed it for the purpose which we find it actually to answer, who comprehended its construction and designed its use. Every indication of contrivance, every manifestation of design which existed in the watch exists in the works of nature, with the difference on the side of nature of being greater or more, and in a degree which exceeds all computation. What he's saying is our universe, not just the cosmos, but at the biological level, is more complex than a watch. Way more complex than a watch. Like literally, the way your body is dealing with protein synthesis and the various things that are happening is way more complex than how the nicest sort of Patek Philippe watch has all the movements inside of it. It's more complex than that. Now, partially what happens is Paley gets dragged through the mud, right? I mean, his basic argument was that if the complexity of a watch and its evident design, basically implies the existence of a watchmaker, how much more does vastly more intricate biological mechanisms like the human eye demand the existence of a divine watchmaker? The design marks are too strong to get over. Design must have a designer. Everything looks designed. Paley's just drawing the conclusion like, gosh, he's trying to show the immodesty of what Crick was saying earlier. You must not think, you might think you found a watch that was designed by something. We just have to remember, it's just a rock. What? Okay, all right. But throughout history, many scientists have found this plausible, and Darwin used to love this argument until later, after his thing, he basically made Paley his scapegoat, and they had all these debates, and everyone tried to diss him, and he came under a lot of attack. But the basic argument he made still stands. Even like Bertrand Russell, let me find him here. He has if I had highlights, I could find it really quickly, but it should be somewhere in here. We're getting there. Here we go. Whatever the answer is, it's clear the net results of the criticism of Paley and his iconic association with all that's regarded about design. In other words, Paley makes his argument, and everyone just basically did ad hominems against him. And then you had David Hume saying stupid things like, well, if we see design in this world, we'd have to see all the other worlds to know what design doesn't look like. I'm like, that's the stupidest argument in the world. You don't make that argument with anything. People are like, that makes sense. I'm like, oh my gosh. But Bertrand Russell, who is not a theist at the time of this, and he found the design argument logically impressive from Paley. He says this argument, quote, contends that on a survey of the known world, we find things which cannot possibly be explained as the product of blind natural forces, but are much more reasonably to be regarded as evidences of a beneficent purpose. This argument has no formal logical defect. Its premises are empirical, and its conclusion professes to be reached in accordance with the usual canons of empirical inference. The question whether it is to be accepted or not turns, therefore, not on general metaphysical questions, but on comparatively detailed considerations, unquote. But before we go on, he deals with Hume. I don't want to get into it because it's just dumb. If you need to get Hume to understand why this argument is, go have fun. But Hume's basic point was like that clocks, and so you got to remember at the time that Paley's writing, technology looked a lot like steampunk. You know what I'm saying? Like everything was like cogs and gears. Well, biology doesn't look very steampunk. Like if you look under how many of you looked under a microscope ever and seen anything that's awesome? You don't really see gears, although snowflakes are kind of interesting. But you don't really see gears necessarily. So I think what happened is they would just like say, well, I don't see gears. It doesn't look very organized to me. I think Hume and the dumb arguments would really are shown when you look at the molecular machine idea today with a cutting-edge molecular biology. But he would have learned, Hume would have been astonished to learn that it would one day be possible in laboratories in this world for human intelligence to design biochemical systems and construct proteins that in all probability are not that far from the present horizon. It will be possible to construct simple organisms from their molecular components. What would Hume say then about organization and design? In other words, people dissed Paley, but they had to do so for a reason. I guess the idea we'd have to say is that Hume's argument isn't an argument that's about mechanisms, it's an argument about abduction, going back to the best explanation for something we see. Where we have it. So, but the main topic we're on here is this. The widespread contention that evolution eliminates the need for a creator. That's what we're dealing with. So paleontologist Stephen Jay Gould, a materialist, remember when we say materialist, it doesn't mean he's material. It doesn't mean he's Madonna, material girl. A materialist means just material is all that exists. It's like a form of naturalism. We're using these interchangeably, even though they're not quite the same thing. Naturalism, materialism, atheism. They're both saying the same thing. Only the material things of this world is what exists. Okay, that's material. So Stephen Jay Gould, a materialist by philosophical conviction, and that's a big deal. He held that after Darwin, we know that, quote, no intervening spirit watches lovingly over the affairs of nature. No vital forces propel evolutionary change, and whatever we think of God, his existence is not manifest in the products of nature. These are stupid statements. It's hard for me to process it. Indeed, not long after the publication of The Origin of Species, the famous American atheist Robert Greene Ingersoll wrote that the 19th century would be, quote, Darwin's century when his, quote, doctrine of evolution has removed in every thinking mind the last vestige of orthodox Christianity. The point was repeated by Sir Julian Huxley when in the 1959 Darwin Centennial in Chicago, he summed up the implications of evolution as he saw them. Quote, in the evolutionary scheme of thought, there is no longer either need or room for the supernatural. The earth was not created, it evolved. So did all the animals and plants that inhabit it, including our human selves, mind and soul, as well as brain and body. So he's telling us that our soul is something that came from evolution too somehow. It's fascinating. So did religion. In Huxley's opinion, evolution displaces God, giving us a purely naturalistic explanation of the origin not only of life, but of the higher faculties of consciousness and thought. Now, I want to repeat this so you understand this. You say to yourself, that's crazy. But when you go to the Natural History Museum, you're going to a museum of history told from the perspective that only natural causes have given us everything we have. It is literally a mythological museum. It is not science. Now, they might do scientific discoveries, but the story they're telling is not a scientific story. There's no data for that story. Literally, all the data goes against their story. And all the arrogant people that are being arrogant against it need to face the fact that their arrogance doesn't give them evidence. Bluster is no substitute for argument. And I'm going to get to this at the end, but the problem that's irritating me all along is that the Natural History Museum, Huxley, all these guys are making a philosophical argument. And they're terrible philosophers, but they're doing it in a lab coat and trying to intimidate you. Their philosophical argument is very, very weak. But their bluster is, well, I've got all this data. I'm like, it's a totally different subject. We're not talking about data. We're talking about the story you're telling about the data. That's crazy. That doesn't even pass basic logic. But regardless, here we are, right? They're saying things like this. In Huxley's opinion, evolution displaces God, gives us a purely naturalistic explanation of not only the origin of life, but of everything. And so this view that atheism is the logical consequence of evolutionary theory is not only to be found in popular science books, but actually university textbooks. Take, for example, the following statement from a reputable university textbook on evolution. I have a theory. Oh, no, it didn't work. I thought if I turned it, maybe my notes would come up. The whole time I'm talking, it's bothering me. That's just, if I go to someone's house and you want to annoy me, if you invite me to your house and you just make one of your pictures crooked, the whole time I'm talking, I won't go straighten it or anything. I'll just be totally irritated about that picture. And I'm not like that, but, all right, here we go. So Huxley says all this. Where am I at? But this idea that atheism is a logical consequence of this theory is coming in textbooks. So, for example, this is a statement from the reputable university textbook on evolution by Monroe Strickenberger of the Museum of Vertebrate Zoology in Berkeley. It says, quote, the fear that Darwinism was an attempt to displace God in the sphere of creation was justified. To the question, is there a divine purpose for the creation of humans? Evolution answers no. According to evolution, the adaptations of species and the adaptations of humans come from natural selection and not from design. Douglas Fuduyama agrees, quote, by coupling undirected, purposeless variation to the blind, uncaring process of natural selection, Darwin made theological or spiritual explanations of the life processes superfluous. Together with Marx's materialistic theory of history and society and Freud's attribution of human behavior to influences over which we have little control, Darwin's theory of evolution was a crucial plank in the platform of mechanism and materialism of much of science, in short, that has been the stage of most Western thought. Now, first of all, there's a few things about that statement that are phenomenally impressive. One, he just put together the entire coalition of the left. Notice what he said. Marx's materialistic theory of history, Freud's attribution of human behavior to influences over which we have little control. And Darwin is the crucial plank that allows those other two theories to float. So what happens when we reject obvious Marxism? Because we're in it right now. Everyone's Marxist. We're going to debate Darwin it's going to come back. We're going to debate it all over again. This is coming. Anyways, it's scarcely surprising that there's a widespread feeling that the theory of evolution not only has swept God away as unnecessary, that God's irrelevant, if not positively even embarrassing, right? Philosopher Roger Scruton is a typical example, giving as his reason, quote, I have a scientific mind. I can't just dismiss the evidence of Darwinism. It seems to me to be obviously true. And philosopher Roger Scruton might have a scientific mind, but his philosophical mind seems to have left the building. I don't know where he would say the evidence, because the bait and switch is so irritatingly true. I'm losing my mind right now even talking about it. It's just, you'll see what I mean. We're confronted with the following rather odd situation. On the one hand, there's the almost instinctive and overwhelming temptation to infer from the existence and nature of biological information that it has an intelligent origin. Like, in other words, we all recognize that. No one debates that everything looks designed. On the other hand, some of the very people who are studying that design and that tell us that that temptation is the strongest resist it the most. Why? Why would they insist that it's an unguided, mindless evolutionary process and can't do it all? And the impression you might get is, well, the data must have told them that. It's no exaggeration to say the theory of evolution had the impact of an earthquake on the human quest for significance, an impact that extends every aspect of human life. If life is a result of a purely naturalistic process, what about morality? Has it too evolved? What about significance? Or what about right and wrong, justice and truth? In other words, when I tell you about Marxism, I tell you the arguments don't actually matter. And you say to yourself, but words matter, truth matters. No. Remember, if you're a Darwinist, those are merely guises for power. Scientifically, Darwin shows us none of those things exist. We're all just biological reproduction machines trying to get our bananas and our mates and whatever sources we need to do it, whether it's words, using truth and morality and spirituality to do so. And so you can see how it strips everything down. It strips rationality down, and it strips down what actually is Western thought. It is biological Marxism is what it is. And that's crazy. And if you follow what I just said, you'll be like, that's awesome. If you don't follow it, just let it go. But anyways, we go, where are we at? William Provine said this: the destructive assumptions of evolutionary biology extend far beyond the assumptions of organized religion to a much deeper, more pervasive belief held by the vast majority of people. That non-mechanistic organizing designs or forces are somehow responsible for the visible order of the physical universe, biological organisms, and human moral order. This is what Schaeffer wrote about specifically. It's why Schaeffer keeps coming up. His whole point was that as the biologists are using Darwin to tell you that you don't exist, you are a machine, he said the mannishness of man revolts against it. But Daniel Dennett thinks we've not yet really taken on board the implications of evolution. He therefore calls evolution Darwin's dangerous idea because it cuts much deeper into the fabric of our most fundamental beliefs than many of its sophisticated apologists have yet admitted, even to themselves. In other words, what Schaeffer was doing is he's saying, I want you to take your Darwinism to its conclusion and act like it's real and live in reality with it. Because Schaeffer's point and our point needs to be, if you're going to believe these things, you don't get to live in my reality to argue it. Period. If these things are just guises for power. Like, you don't get to do that. We can't allow them to do that. That's the point. You have to make them live out the conclusions of their beliefs. Dawkins agrees, though, with Dennett. He says, quote, we no longer have to resort to superstition when faced with deep problems. Is there a meaning to life? What are we here for? What is man? After posing the last of these questions, the eminent zoologist G.G. Simpson put it thus: the point I want to make now is that all attempts to answer that question before 1859 are worthless, and we will be better off if we ignore them completely. Ooh, that sounds like a smart guy. Dawkins' argument is that if evolutionary mechanisms can account for the apparent design of the universe, then all intelligent origin ideas would be false. And he tells us we can't have both God and evolution. And since everything can be accounted for by evolution, there's no creator. Evolution implies atheism. But his argument depends on certain assumptions. Assumption number one. Here's his first assumption he's making. Biological evolution is incompatible with the existence of a creator. Well, that's not necessarily true. We talked, like, how do you think that we have all the variety of things we have? What kinds of animals do you think that Noah brought in there? He brought kinds. And so evolution is perfectly compatible with God and how God works and nature and nurture and how things happen. Absolutely. That's not the argument. The second one, he says biological evolution accounts for the existence of all of life's complexity. It's that second point that's so crazy. Neither point is actually true. There are Christians that believe in evolution. I think there's reasons they shouldn't, but the way they're using evolution, they keep switching it from what I'm saying to this other philosophical point, which isn't scientific. I'll get to that in 20 minutes. But most people think there's nothing really to discuss. The question we get to is understanding like what's happening. Does evolution exclude God first? The idea that God and biological evolution are mutually exclusive alternatives implies, first of all, that God and evolution belong in the same category of explanation, but it's plainly false. As we've already seen in different contexts, a category mistake is being committed when someone says that, right? Evolution purports to be a mechanism, a biological mechanism. And those who believe in God do not believe in God as a mechanism. They believe in God as a originator, a designer. And so the engine doesn't mean Mr. Ford doesn't exist. It's an absurd contention at the front end. It shouldn't be made. It is made only by carelessly, right? Evolution purports to be a biological mechanism, period. And so that's how it works. But you look at Dawkins' famous description of evolutionary blind watchmaker. What do you say again? The only watchmaker in nature is the blind forces of physics. Natural selection, the blind, unconscious, automatic process which Darwin discovered and which we now know is the explanation for the existence and apparently purposeful forms of all life, has no purpose in mind. If it can be said to play the role of a watchmaker in nature, it's that of a blind watchmaker, unquote. Very carefully, 5 claims are being made here. 2 about the forces of physics and 3 about natural selection. The first is that the forces of physics are the only watchmaker in nature. Okay, that's what he just said. Number 2, that the forces of physics are blind. Number 3, that natural selection is blind, automatic. It's a process with no purpose in mind. Number 4, that natural selection is the explanation for the existence of all life. And number 5, natural selection is the explanation for the form of all life. And first of all, no data shows this. In fact, even their own data doesn't show this. When you say to somebody that's a Darwinian evolutionist, here's a great way to say it. They say the ecosystem, if you mess up one thing, it messes up everything, right? Okay. I thought ecosystems are going to organize themselves. What do you mean? If I mess up one thing, it messes up everything. I thought everything's going to come from nothing. What the heck are you talking about? Like, if I kill a bee, everything else dies? Well, then how did everything come from goo? Like, what in the world are you saying? You can't do both sides of your mouth. He's like, no, man, you're not understanding the point. I'm like, okay. Basic things we know, and I hate to do it. I hate to do it because it's so easy to, like, caricature this, but like the basic thing we understand in nature is decay, not organization. If you put a frog in a blender, that's organic material. It's better than what the evolution starts with, which is even organic. And you put it in a blender and you turn it on, and you leave that blender there for 1,000,000 years, an alligator is not going to crawl out. You're like, Matt, that's not really what we're saying. Well, I'm sorry, what I just said is more likely than what you're saying. You're saying if you just have rocks sitting there in a goo with electricity, you're going to have. And the striking thing about his claims is this. The first is this, ready? They take us way beyond Darwin. First, the implication 1 is that natural selection is a process, is reducible to the laws of physics. And it's a claim which Darwin doesn't make. And natural selection, by definition, assumes that life is there, or at least a system capable of self-replication to start with. In other words, it already starts with life. Natural selection has nothing to do with how life began. It just says what happens to life. It's a mechanism of like how species interact in their environment. That's it. Like, well, since we understand this mechanism, we understand how everything came to be. I'm like, what are you talking about? That doesn't make sense. There's nothing to select from. The danger of sliding rather superficially over the transition from non-living to living is something we'll get to later, but that's always in my mind. Secondly, Darwin ascribes creative power to the forces of physics, and then he personifies them. And this one's the one that irritates me the most. These forces are the watchmaker, he says. The rhetoric of personification is important because it can subtly add sort of an illusion, a false credibility to an otherwise unsubstantiated thesis, right? We're more likely to grant that a person has creative powers than an impersonal force, so that's why we make the force with a capital E for evolution or capital N for nature, right? There's nothing controversial in describing forces or mechanisms as blind. I don't need to tell you that your car operates blind. Like, oh man, your car, actually, the computer's actually blind. ChatGPT is blind. It's just ones and zeros. I don't have to tell you that it's blind. The only reason when we say blind, what do we mean? We're smuggling in the idea of a person that can't see but certainly could do other things. We're smuggling in intelligence, purpose, and all these things and just taking away eyes. It's a word that is meant to depersonify God, but it never really does. It just changes his name to nature. And so what they do is he talks about this, and I don't want to get into it, but the mechanisms, he goes on. It's easy to miss the point, though, when read Dawkins, because the subtle rhetoric that personifies evolutionary process. It makes you think that he's argued away real personal agency when he's done the opposite. In fact, at no point has Dawkins ever attempted to address the question of whether or not personal agency is even involved. He just simply says it's not. The lesson is that we need to be wary of the rhetoric of science in this kind of context, since descriptions of putative evolutionary mechanisms are often loaded with words such as blind, automatic, purposeless, which because their ambiguity in context tends to convey the impression that the question of intelligence and agency has been investigated and rejected, when all they're doing is saying these words, and they're actually inserting humanity into their own mechanisms themselves. Using Dawkins' own terminology, one's tempted to say that he's appeared to deal with the question, but that appearance is an illusion. The actual logic at issue here is well captured by physicist Sir John Houghton, who said, quote, "The fact that we understand some of the mechanisms of the working of the universe or of living systems does not preclude the existence of a designer any more than the possession of insight into the processes by which a watch has been put together, however automatic those processes may appear, implies that there can be no watchmaker. A self-winding watch doesn't all of a sudden get rid of a watchmaker. That even says how awesome it is to design that." He says, let me find the next thing. This is helpful. It's really helpful, guys. The other big thing that he keeps saying, and I can't find it here, but is that he keeps making the statement of the mechanism, and he jumps to therefore that mechanism can bear all the weight to explain everything. And I'm like, that is an absurd claim. So where do we get to it? Here we go. So why insist that evolution implies atheism? The argument that the existence of the mechanism doesn't preclude the activity of intelligent agency seems logically compelling to many scientists, and it therefore puzzles them, especially in light of the cautionary statements such as those made by Huxley and Gould. So why do so many scientists tenaciously maintain the line that evolution implies atheism? Logically, they all kind of recognize it doesn't, but they keep going with it. And so Daniel Dennett, right, gives us an explanation. He maintains that a mechanism doesn't in general logically preclude the existence of a designer. Nevertheless, here, Dennett's point is, it's not that evolution is just a mechanism. It's the particular kind of evolutionary mechanism that it is, that Darwin found, is of such a kind that it doesn't even need a designer. In other words, he's saying this mechanism is so profound and powerful, it doesn't need a designer. Okay, so the reason this is an important quote is it's telling us where they're putting the weight. And I would argue in a very modest way. You don't have to deny evolution at all. That's why? Who cares? But you could say, do you think that your argument that evolution as a mechanism can bear the weight you're putting on it for all meaning versus non-meaning? You think that mechanism can bear the weight you're asking it to bear? See how modest that is? It really can't, by the way. And that's the kind of statement that's not threatening to people, that doesn't get into smoke and no heat and no light. But the idea that he's getting to is ambiguous. Dennett basically says this. He says, natural selection somehow designs without either itself being designed or having any purpose in view. And he says it's a mindless, motiveless mechanicity. It's a different process, and that's what it happens because we have a long period of time. He goes on, and Dennett goes on to make it clear that he means that Darwinian mechanism is mindless and motiveless in the sense that it has neither mind nor motive behind it. It's agentless mechanism. Love it or hate it, phenomena like DNA exhibit the heart of the power of the Darwinian idea. An impersonal, unreflective, robotic, mindless little scrap of molecular machinery is the ultimate basis of all agency and hence meaning and hence consciousness in the universe, unquote. And to use the language of Aristotle, Dennett claims that this is the very nature of the efficient cause that rules out the very existence of the final cause, but whatever. The basic question we have to ask is if Dennett's analysis is correct, and it's not. We have to deal with this idea. The question we have to ask is natural selection account not merely for the form of life, but for the existence of life? Remember, Darwin's Origin of Species was trying to account for the form of life. And these guys are like, well, that explanation now tells us about the existence of life itself. That's a big bait and switch. I mean, it's bigger than saying flatten the curve to stop the spread, but it's same idea. It just changed lanes really quick and no one paid attention to it. So again, the argument was, hey, this is telling us how life has changed, and therefore this tells us how life began. I'm not sure I got that part. Can you explain that jump to me? You don't believe it? No, I'm just wanting you to explain it. How dare you question it? I'm like, I thought we were doing science. Right? And so that's what Dawkins says. You cannot question it. Chinese paleontologist Jun Yun Chen ran into the problem coming to the USA. He says, in China, you can't talk about the government, but you can talk about science. In America, you can talk about the government, but you can't talk about evolution. But so Lennox goes forward, and he talks about this idea of questioning. But what he's getting to is this. This guy Strickenberger and the rest, they basically say that part of the motivation behind evolutionary theory lies in an attempt to remove God. That's their whole point. This gave them an excuse to do it. And we're led to the question of just what sort of relationship is between evolutionary theory and metaphysics. And there is a connection. We know that the theory of evolution that they're telling us about is a theory that came out in the ancient times. Evolutionary theory, the way they're describing everything from nothing, came out during the Greeks and the rest. In fact, the data isn't pointing to this at all. This is them finding the data and taking their religious view to now interpret the data. And and you can find this very easily, right? C.S. Lewis says it this way. He explains, he says, the funeral of a great myth. He explains that we must sharply distinguish between evolution as a biological theorem and popular evolutionism, which is certainly a myth. Lewis grounds the assertion, first of all, in chronology. He goes, quote, if popular evolutionism were, as it imagines itself to be, not a myth, but the intellectually legitimate result of scientific study, it would arise after the study. But he goes on to say it did not. Historically, the philosophy of evolutionism appeared long before the biological theory of evolution. Secondly, Lewis offers internal evidence to his claim. He says evolutionism differs in content from the evolution of the real biologist. To a biologist studying evolution, evolution is a hypothesis that covers facts that helps us to see how things change. And it's a useful fact, and they'll use that until it's unhelpful. But that's not what Dawkins and the rest are saying. They're giving you a philosophical claim, and that's the big issue, right? That's the heart of the matter. We argued already that naturalism doesn't follow from biological evolution, but what about the reverse deduction? Suppose that naturalism was true. Let's just go with it for a minute. Then merely as a matter of sheer logical necessity, then evolution must be true as an account for origins. In other words, they've already rigged the game. So they'll say, since we know that only natural processes existing, then evolution must be the answer for how everything came to be the way it is. Because they have no other option, because they can only use natural causes, because there's only a natural world. There is nothing outside of it already. They've already rigged the game. And so I'm running out of time, so I'm going to do my little paper that I did, which is great. And I actually have that, so that didn't go away. I don't think. All right, so it's on the website. It's called The Bait, the Switch, and the Weight Nature Cannot Bear. So feel free to read it, trade it like a Pokemon card, do whatever you want with it. It's great. All right, here it is. Let's be clear from the outset. What is often called the debate over evolution is rarely about biology in any serious sense. It's about authority, autonomy, and it's about which worldview is allowed to explain everything. This is why I'm not intimidated when we meet biologists and chemists. I'm like, great, they're coming to my arena. They're talking about philosophy and worldview, not the sciences. Most of the confusion comes not from bad science, but from category errors, mechanisms being inflated into metaphysics, and philosophy smuggled in under the borrowed authority of a lab coat. So first, when mechanisms start talking like a mind, we got to deal with it. First, listen carefully to the language of evolutionary naturalism as it's commonly preached. Quote, evolution designed the eye. Quote, nature selected the fittest. Quote, evolution solved the problem. Quote, nature found a way. That's what Malcolm says in Jurassic Park, I point out. That's not scientific descriptions. Those are personified language. You never say, math finds a way. Like, this is a stupid statement. Mechanisms don't design, processes don't invent, matter doesn't intend, bricks don't become buildings unless you design and put them together. But the language is unavoidable. Why? Well, because once God's excluded, something still has to carry the explanatory weight. The universe still looks purposeful, it still looks ordered, intelligence still looks real. That's why that one time I was talking to the guy, I said, stop using design language because you said it's not. So nature has to be then capitalized. Evolution has to be capitalized. Design is denied explicitly, but it's reintroduced rhetorically. So they remove God with one hand, and they quietly replace him with an impersonal substitute that behaves suspiciously like a mind. They do this in all kinds of subjects, by the way. Again, everything came from nothing, but nothing's really a vacuum. Well, a vacuum's something. It's just something you named nothing. But, okay, second one, it's not an accidental move. This isn't a linguistic accident. It's a necessary move. Because the controlling commitment underneath modern evolutionary naturalism is not follow the evidence where it leads. It's this: only natural causes may be admitted a priori, at the front end. That rule isn't discovered by science, it's imposed upon the scientific philosophical arguments. Naturalism is not a conclusion, it is a dogma that they start with. That is true, which means that no matter what evidence you find, God must never be allowed as an explanation, purpose must be renamed, design must be described, and the mind must be reduced, which is not neutrality, it's philosophy acting as gatekeeper. It's very similar to what Galileo had to go against with heliocentrism. Secondly, number 3 rather, the bait. Now we come to the familiar move. We observe adaptation. Populations change, traits shift. Organisms respond to environments. You can go take all the dogs in the world and you can make little dogs, big dogs, wiener dogs, powerful dogs, all the dogs. You put them all together on an island, you're going to get a mutt. That's a regression towards the mean. But you put them in their separate environments, and we do that all the time. That happens with animals, that happens with people, it happens with things, we could do that. Christians have no reason to fear mechanisms. God governs a world full of means and mechanisms. And you could call this microevolution, micro-level change if you like, or just call it evolution that's what it is. But then comes the big switch from mechanism to metaphysics. The observable mechanism is quietly inflated into an ultimate explanation. They start to capitalize evolution, and they don't mean the mechanism anymore, they mean God. Because bacteria adapt, life must have arisen from non-life? That's hard. Because populations change, design must be an illusion? What? And more tellingly, because matter can't bridge the gap to mind, and I say it again, we'll see it again next week, mind itself can't be real. And this is the move many naturalists make but rarely advertise because it sounds so stupid. Since blind process can't generate consciousness, rationality, or meaning, the solution isn't to explain someone having a mind, it's to deny that it exists. They say we have a brain that's real, we have neurons that are real, but your mind, self, your thought, meaning, they're illusions, just like design. That's the honest end of materialism, and man is reduced to a biochemical machine reporting survival impulses. I think Sam Harris called it the noble lie that we need to keep propagating our own existence. So not only is God excluded, but man becomes nothing more than a mechanism, and we dissolve ourselves as well, all so they can be autonomous. So here's where the real debate actually is. The real issue is not evolution as a process of adaptation and change. The real issue is evolution as a mechanism that made everything from nothing. And I call it abiogenesis, everything from nothing. How life comes from non-life, how information arises from chemistry, how consciousness emerges from matter, how reason arises from non-rational forces, how moral obligation arises from molecules. These aren't laboratory observations. They're not repeatable experiments. They are philosophical claims about ultimate origins, and the more confidently someone tells it to you, the more uneducated philosophically they are. That's kind of my point. The modest person you can have a great conversation with. The bluster person that says like all this stuff with a lot of confidence, you just need to recognize they don't understand what they're doing. Like, you shouldn't be freaked out from them. They're the equivalent of a guy that doesn't know how to fight and says, I just see red and the body's falling. Like, okay, I'm really intimidated by that. They deliver with the authority of science, which is the bait. Biology ends up being used as a cover for metaphysical naturalism, which is not scientific. The authority of their claim is not the authority they have. Science can describe processes, but it cannot pronounce ultimates. Science cannot tell you that only matter exists. There's no experiment. There's nothing that could tell you that. Science cannot tell you that purpose is an illusion. The fact that they could say that boldly is embarrassing. Science cannot tell you that your mind is unreal. Science cannot tell you that meaning is a trick of survival. In fact, the Bible tells us that God says, fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, that you're a fool if you don't start with the idea that there is a God. And these statements are foolish. I don't have a mind, and words don't exist, as I use words to tell other minds. Those are philosophical claims. When someone says evolution proves there is no God, that's not biology speaking. It's autonomy preaching. It's Genesis 3 in modern dress, man determining reality in his own terms. So what do we need to do? We have to press the contradiction that the speakers deny. Follow this worldview honestly, and the claims become even more radical. If only matter exists, then words don't really exist, meaning doesn't exist, minds don't exist, selves do not exist. There are only brain states and noise, and yet, notice what must happen for the worldview to be communicated. Books are written, arguments are made, words are carefully chosen, meaning is intended, minds are addressed, and selves are persuaded. The system cannot even be stated without violating itself. They deny words while using words. They deny minds while addressing minds, and they deny selves while appealing to persons, which this is not a minor inconsistency, it's a total failure of coherence. And the worst part is, this is why I'm telling you this now, is that I want you to be modest and kind and not be intimidated by this. This is where Schaeffer presses the issue. They cannot live in the world that they say is real. No one reasons as though logic is an illusion. No one loves as though persons are fictions. No one argues as though arguments are chemical spasms, except for the Marxists today. I mean, that's kind of what's interesting. The scientific naturalist demands to be taken seriously, while his system insists that seriousness itself is unreal. He borrows reason, he borrows meaning, he borrows moral obligation from the Christian worldview every time he opens his mouth, and Scripture tells us why he does it. He's made in the image of God. Meaning is real because God speaks, and mind is real because God is a mind. And words matter because creation itself came by the word, but we want to be autonomous. And so they say this so they can sleep with who they want, so they can cheat on their taxes. They don't have to be accountable to anybody. Remember, this isn't about finches. It's not about genes. It's not about mechanistic evolution. It's about whether that mechanism itself is ultimate. Whether nature, with a capital N, is all that exists. Whether man will submit to the Creator or enthrone himself as judge of reality. When evolution is made, the mechanism is made to explain everything metaphysically, it stops being science. It becomes philosophy wearing a lab coat. And when you take the roof off of their view, the rocks of reality hit them in the face. A worldview that denies God cannot account for the world that they're in. A worldview that denies design cannot live within it. And a worldview that dissolves mind must borrow mind in order to deny it. The problem is not that evolution occurs. The problem is that the claim that that mechanism explains everything there is not scientific. It's not livable. It's not logical. Let's pray. God, thank you for tonight. You are so good. My main concern tonight isn't to checkmate atheists or whatever. Protect us from that impulse. Protect us from sort of echo chamber cliches and gotchas. The people we're talking about are real people made in your image, and they need the gospel. And the gospel is not a political party. It's not something that we hold to because we like Pepsi over Coke. It is true truth, exclusive truth. It's the kind of truth that allows us to see. I pray, Father, that you would help us to be very patient, very loving, but above all, help us to be bold. Humble, but bold in our ability to stand in front of the bluster, calmly asking questions, understanding the category error, always being ready to give an answer for the hope that's in us. I pray you would use us to prepare us for these moments, at the very least, to just not be cowed. Help us to have the kind of boldness we see in Acts chapter 4. We know, God, that you are sovereign. We know what you've done. We know what you're doing. And we trust in what you're going to continue to do. We praise you in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, we'll see you next week.